Canada's most hated victim, the Cindy James mystery. For 7 years, she was a prisoner in her own life. She claimed a phantom stalker left her threatening notes, made terrifying, silent phone calls, and put her through violent, ritualistic attacks. She documented over 100 of these incidents. But to the very people sworn to protect her, she wasn't a victim. She was a liar. This is the story of Cindy James, a woman whose desperate pleas for help were ignored, right up until she was found dead, drugged, and hogtied in a vacant yard. Her death left behind a mystery so baffling that the authorities could only call it one thing: an unknown event. In the world of Canadian true crime, few cases are as strange or as tragic as that of Cynthia Cindy James. She was a 44-year-old nurse living a quiet life in the suburbs of Vancouver, a professional who cared for others, who suddenly found herself the target of a relentless campaign of terror. For nearly 7 years, from October 1982 to her death in May of 1989, Cindy's life became a catalog of horrors. It all started with whispers on a telephone line, but it escalated into a series of bizarre and brutal assaults. But here's the thing: the more she reported, the more she was disbelieved. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, spent over $1 million on her case, only to conclude that her tormentor didn't exist. They came to believe that Cindy James, a woman living in constant fear, was the architect of her own suffering. Her family, friends, and her private investigator saw a terrified victim crying out for help. The police saw a master manipulator staging an elaborate and ultimately fatal hoax. The truth, buried for decades, lies somewhere in that chilling space between two realities. It's a testament to what can happen when a victim's voice is silenced, not just by an attacker, but by the very system designed to protect her. The haunting begins. The nightmare began, as it so often does, with a phone call. It was October 1982, just 4 months after Cindy James had separated from her husband of 11 years, a psychiatrist named Dr. Roy Makepeace. The voice on the other end was muffled, guttural, and terrifyingly persistent. Her mother, Tilly Hack, said Cindy told her she didn't recognize the voice. Sometimes it was a whisper, other times just dead, menacing silence. That call was the opening move in a campaign of terror that would slowly tear her life apart. Soon, the harassment bled from the phone lines into the real world. Prowlers were heard in the middle of the night. Her porch lights were smashed. Her phone lines were cut. Then came the notes, grotesque messages made from letters cut out of magazines, left on her doorstep like grim offerings. Her friend, Agnes Woodcock, recalled Cindy's chilling take on the stalker's motives. "He doesn't want to kill me," Cindy told her. "He wants to scare me to death." The police first looked at the most obvious suspect, the ex-husband. Roy Makepeace was questioned, but he denied everything and had alibis. He told Cindy's family that she needed serious psychiatric help, a belief that law enforcement would soon adopt. With no other leads, the police were stuck. The calls were too short to trace, the prowler a ghost. For the RCMP, the case was becoming a frustrating waste of time. For Cindy, it was just the beginning. She tried to get her life back. She moved, painted her car, and even changed her last name, all to become invisible to her tormentor. She started seeing a counselor to cope with the unbelievable stress. But the phantom was relentless. The new house was no sanctuary. The strange calls kept coming, and the feeling of being watched never went away. Neighbors started seeing a man lingering outside her home, but his identity was never confirmed. Desperate, Cindy rented out her basement, hoping tenants would scare him off. It didn't work. The tenants soon reported hearing strange noises from Cindy's floor whenever she wasn't home. There was no escape. The attacks grew more brazen and deeply personal. Dead cats were found in her yard, strangled. This morbid escalation seemed to mock her very sense of safety. The invisible enemy was closing in, and Cindy's world was shrinking. She was living under siege, but it was a war she seemed to be fighting completely alone. The police, with binders full of her reports but not a shred of physical evidence, grew more and more skeptical. The official story started to change. Was Cindy James really the victim of a cunning stalker, or was something else going on? It was a question that would cast a long, dark shadow over everything that came next. Escalation and isolation. As months turned into years, the Phantom's attacks on Cindy grew more violent and strangely theatrical. The harassment wasn't just noises and notes anymore. It became a series of physical assaults that left her bruised, terrified, and more alone than ever. Each new incident was a cry for help, but with every report, the gap between her and the RCMP grew wider. One evening, her friend Agnes Woodcock came to visit and found the house dark. Peeking through a window, she saw Cindy's purse and keys on the table, but Cindy was gone. Worried, Agnes went around the house and made a horrifying discovery. She found Cindy huddled in the backyard, a black nylon stocking pulled so tight around her neck she could barely breathe. Cindy gasped that someone had grabbed her from behind. All she saw were a pair of white sneakers before she was choked out. The police investigated, but found nothing. No footprints, no foreign fibers, no sign of a struggle. Just Cindy's story and the nylon stocking, a grim signature that would appear again and again. On another occasion, Cindy was found dazed and wandering in a ditch miles from her home. She had hypothermia and was covered in cuts and bruises. In a bizarre twist, she was wearing a man's work boot and glove. And again, a black nylon stocking was tied around her neck. When asked, Cindy couldn't remember how she got there, just a blank space where the trauma should have been. To investigators, these memory lapses were just more proof that she wasn't credible. The attacks started happening more often. Friends who stayed the night to protect her were woken up by her screams. One night, her friends Tom and Agnes Woodcock heard a loud thump from the basement. Tom ran down to find it on fire. He claimed he saw the silhouette of a man fleeing outside. Cindy told friends a Molotov cocktail had been thrown through the window. But the RCMP's arson investigation came to a very different conclusion. They reported that all the glass from the broken window had fallen outward, suggesting it was broken from inside the house. This was a critical turning point. For the police, it was the best evidence yet that Cindy was faking it all. Frustrated, Cindy hired a private investigator named Ozzy Cabin. She gave him a key, and they used walkie-talkies to stay in touch, a thin line of security in her terrifying world. Cabin believed her. He was on the other end of the radio when Cindy would whisper that someone was outside. He even answered one of the silent phone calls himself. He saw the fear up close. One night, Cabin got a panicked call over the walkie-talkie. He raced to Cindy's house and found a scene of pure horror. Cindy was unconscious on her living room floor. A kitchen knife had been driven through her hand, pinning it to the wood. Beneath the blade was a note made of cutout letters, "Now you must die." When she woke up, Cindy claimed a man had ambushed her, hit her over the head, and injected her with something before staging the scene. The police were called, but their investigation led to the same dead end. No evidence of an intruder. No fingerprints on the note. The syringe was never found. Doctors found a puncture mark on her arm, but couldn't say for sure if she'd been drugged. For the RCMP, the case was a nightmare. They'd spent up to $1.5 million investigating over 100 complaints from Cindy James. They had installed cameras, tapped her phone, and run stakeouts, all for nothing. They never found a single piece of evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. The only constant in every bizarre, terrifying event was Cindy herself. Her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, was still a person of interest, but they could never connect him to anything. Even her PI, Ozzy Cabin, admitted her behavior was often confusing. She could be evasive and seemed to hold back information, making it hard for even her biggest ally to get the full story. She seemed terrified, Yet she wouldn't, or couldn't, answer the one question everyone had. Who was doing this to her? Cindy's mental health fell apart. Believing she was suicidal, her psychiatrist had her admitted to a psychiatric hospital for 10 weeks. While she was there, the harassment stopped completely. When she got out, it started again. To the police, this was more proof she was doing it to herself. To her supporters, it was proof her tormentor was watching her every move. In her diary, Cindy wrote, "They say I'm doing this to myself. I think my best option is suicide." The words show the despair of a woman trapped. She was being terrorized by a phantom no one else could see, and accused by the police of being a liar. She was a victim who had been turned into the villain of her own story, a woman being erased by fear on one side and disbelief on the other. The climax, an unsolved death. By the spring of 1989, something in Cindy James had shifted. The 7-year ordeal had worn her down, but she seemed to have found a new sense of resolve. She told her father, Otto Hack, something that gave him both hope and fear. For the first time, she admitted she was sure she knew who her tormentor was. "If the police can't solve this," she told them, "I'll solve it for them." It was a promise to finally unmask the phantom who had stolen her life. It would be one of the last real conversations they'd ever have. On May 25, 1989, Cindy James vanished. Her car was found later that day in a shopping mall parking lot. The scene was strange. Inside were groceries and a wrapped gift, signs of a normal day. But on the driver's side door, there was blood, and items from her wallet were scattered on the ground underneath. It was a scene that could suggest a violent abduction, but like everything else in this case, it was just vague enough to raise doubts. For 2 agonizing weeks, her family waited. Police searched, but had no real leads. The hope that had sparked after her defiant words to her father began to fade. On June 8, 1989, their worst fears came true. In the yard of an abandoned house in a quiet Richmond suburb, the body of Cindy James was found. The way she was found was a horrifying final echo of the attacks she had described for years. Her hands and feet were bound tightly behind her back in a hogtie position. A black nylon stocking was wrapped around her neck, the signature of her tormentor. An autopsy would later show she died from a massive overdose of morphine and other sedatives. But the drugs were in her system, and the marks on her neck also suggested she'd been strangled. The scene was a paradox. It looked like a brutal murder, the end of a 7-year campaign of terror. Yet the police, who had long suspected Cindy was making it all up, leaned toward a different theory: suicide, or a staged hoax that had gone horribly wrong. Her family was horrified. Her father, a former Air Force lieutenant colonel, was furious. The police did not investigate the possibility of homicide, he told the media, but zeroed in on trying to prove that she committed suicide. The big question was a grim puzzle. Could Cindy have done this to herself? Could she have taken a massive, incapacitating dose of drugs and then managed to tie herself up so intricately? A not expert hired by the RCMP had previously said it was highly unlikely Cindy could have tied the knots from earlier attacks herself. But at the inquest, another expert showed that it was, at least in theory, possible to self-bind in that way. Then there was the question of the drugs. No syringe or cup was found at the scene, leaving the method of ingestion a complete mystery. Experts testified that if she took them orally, she would have had about 15 minutes before they took full effect. Since it took a knot specialist only 3 minutes to recreate the bindings, there was a narrow, but theoretically possible, window for her to have tied the knots herself. But other details just didn't add up. Her private investigator, Ozzie Cabin, pointed to bruises on her body he believed were inconsistent with the scene, suggesting she was killed somewhere else and dumped there. A man squatting in a van just feet from where she was found claimed he saw nothing. Teenagers who hung out at the abandoned property during the 2 weeks she was missing didn't see a body. And a jogger who finally spotted her said he'd run the same route before without noticing her, suggesting her body hadn't been there the whole time. Cindy James was dead. The phantom had either claimed her life, or her fight against him had finally consumed her. The police saw the tragic end of a long-term fabrication. Her family saw a murderer who got away with it, a predator who had used the authorities' own disbelief as a weapon to silence his victim forever. The official investigation into Cindy James's death is closed. For the authorities, the file is complete, but for everyone else, the mystery is more alive than ever. Was she the architect of a 7-year deception that ended in a fatal mistake? Or was she the victim of a brilliant killer who not only tormented her in life, but masterfully framed her in death? The case remains one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries. We want to know what you think happened. Share your theory in the comments below. And if you find these dives into the shadows of the human mind compelling, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. The aftermath and lingering questions. In the spring of 1990, a coroner's inquest was held to investigate the death of Cindy James. It would become the longest and one of the most exhaustive in British Columbia's history, a 40-day deep dive into a case that had baffled everyone for years. Over 80 witnesses testified, including her family, friends, ex-husband Roy Makepeace, PI Ozzie Cabin, police officers, and various experts. The inquest was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. The two competing stories were laid bare. The RCMP presented their case, built on 7 years of dead ends and growing suspicion. They pointed to the total lack of physical evidence tying anyone to the nearly 100 incidents Cindy reported. They brought up inconsistencies in her stories and the convenient memory lapses after the worst attacks. They showed the evidence from the basement fire, where the glass fell outwards, arguing it was proof of staging. At the inquest, they even had an expert demonstrate how a person could hogtie themselves, suggesting her death was a suicide staged to look like murder. On the other side, Cindy's family and her private investigator painted a portrait of a terrified woman failed by the very system that should have protected her. They argued that the sheer length and escalating violence of the attacks pointed to a real tormentor. Cabin, the PI, testified about the bruises on her body, believing they proved she was killed somewhere else and dumped in the yard. Her father, Otto Hack, accused the police of being so focused on their theory of self-harm that they never conducted a real homicide investigation. During the inquest, more puzzling details came out. Cindy's family revealed that after her death, they found and threw away a large amount of sedatives in her home. Her sister also found a glass cutter, a syringe, and saline solution, items that could have been used to stage incidents. These discoveries seemed to help the police theory. However, other testimony challenged it. An expert who analyzed knots from an earlier attack had concluded it was highly unlikely she could have tied them herself, which supported her story of an attacker. After 40 days and weeks of deliberation, the jury returned. They couldn't decide on the manner of death. They couldn't call it a homicide, a suicide, or an accident. Their official verdict was as unsettling as the case itself. Cindy James died of an unknown event. The longest inquest in the province's history ended with a formal declaration of uncertainty. The case was formally closed, leaving the truth in limbo forever. In the years since, the case has become a true crime legend. The central questions still fuel endless debate. Theory number 1. The police were right. Cindy James, suffering from a severe psychological disorder, made up the entire 7-year ordeal. People who believe this point to the complete lack of evidence, despite a massive police investigation. Her diary entry mentioning suicide and the items her family found are seen as more proof. In this version, her death was the tragic end of a long and elaborate fiction. Theory number 2. Cindy James was murdered. Her family and supporters believe she was the victim of an incredibly cunning and sadistic killer, one smart enough to leave no trace and to slowly destroy her credibility. This theory suggests the killer knew how police worked and used their growing disbelief against her. Her fear and reluctance to name her attacker could be explained by threats against her family, something she claimed he had made. Her death, then, was the killer's final move, silencing his victim and framing it to look exactly like what the police already believed it was, a suicide. There's also a third possibility, one that's maybe the most tragic, that the police failures created the perfect environment for a killer to operate freely. Whether Cindy was a perfect victim or not, the system failed her. A woman reported over 100 crimes, and instead of being protected, she was investigated. Her credibility was put on trial long before her death. This could have emboldened a predator, showing him he could act without any consequences. In this scenario, her death is the direct result of a killer who knew he was hunting in a place the law wouldn't go. The legacy of Cindy James is a haunting story of fear, doubt, and unanswered questions. For 7 years, she lived a life caught between the terror of a phantom and the cold skepticism of the authorities. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how we see victims, especially when their stories are messy and complicated. Was she a master manipulator who created a fiction so powerful it finally killed her? Or was she a terrified woman, stalked by a predator so brilliant that he made her very reality seem like a delusion? The official verdict of unknown event is perhaps the most honest answer we'll ever get, a sign of a case where the truth became so twisted it may never be found. The tragedy of Cindy James isn't just in her bizarre and lonely death, but in the agonizing years that came before it. It's the story of a woman who cried out for help over and over, only to have her voice drowned out by doubt. Whether a killer got away with murder, or a troubled woman was failed by the very system she turned to for help, the outcome is the same. A life was lost, and justice was never served. The file may be closed, but the mystery of what really happened to Canada's most hated victim lives on. A chilling reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones no one else believes in.